Hi! On the Woodpecker today? Finally, I'm making the last two small windows that were missing at the cottage. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I've made a pair of windows for the cottage back in 2013. But maybe you don't know that I'm a liar. Those are the two new windows I built to replace the ones at my cottage. Next year, I'll replace the other two. So now, 6 years later, I'm making the remaining two. But this time around, I'm not alone. No, I'm doing those windows with two young French citizens on vacation here, wanting to learn how to make something out of wood for their future farm. And why not making windows in the wild? The first thing to do is make sure my window opening is the same as my plans. As a matter of fact, this episode is pretty similar to the one I did in the past. I'm putting the link up here in case you're interested in seeing it. And just like last time, we're going to make the sills first. After the first cut, I'm tracing its shape. Then I mark the end of the angle with the marking gauge. I show how an electric plane works, and Ariane does the other sill. Now it's time to make this a bit nicer. But we're not done. We need to shape both bottoms. I begin by making the first cut, trace the end of the angle, and we're back to the end tools. Just like before, I demonstrate, and Ariane and Thomas do the work. I'm telling you, it's less tiring watching other people work. Now that the general shape of both sills is done, I can rip thinner boards for the side and top of the exterior frames. Next, I cut a groove for the separator between the fixed and mobile windows. Now we're ready to cut all this to the final dimensions. But before, I sharpen the saw, because it's been a while since its last sharpening. After a demonstration, it's time to let my guests have fun. Here you can clearly see that they're not from around here, because I'm wearing a t-shirt and short, while they're in winter coats and hat. But we're not done with the frames yet. We need to make some rabbits on the top pieces. And now we can cut both sills to their final shape. The last thing we do at the end of the first day is to glue and screw both exterior frames. With a bit of help, this goes pretty well. The very first thing we do on the second day is to cut the separators between both window frames. When it's done, I glue them in place and leave this alone to dry. Now we need to start to work on the rest of the windows. We begin by ripping all the pieces for the windows frames. Okay, but even for me, when it's under 10 Celsius, I need to cover a bit. But ripping all the pieces goes pretty fast with Ariane's help. When it's done, it's time to turn off the generator because all the rest of the job will be made by hand. First of all, my new helpers make sure that the end of each piece I've just ripped are straight. When it's done, they use a stop and cut all the pieces for both big frames. Then I show them how to use a marking gauge, and they mark the pieces for a bridle joint. Then Ariane and Thomas cut all the joints for both big frames. I watch them for a while to make sure they are doing a good job. And it's not bad actually. When all four corners are cut, I take care of the true mortise in the center of the frame. At this point, we have a really good pace. They're getting the hang of cutting a bridle joint. And when the first frame is done, I assemble it and mark where I should cut the rabbet for the window and cut it while the joints of the second frame are being done. At the end of our second day, we were able to glue both big frames. We let them dry on the front porch to make sure that if it rains during the night, they won't get wet. The next day, we start to work on the small frames. In fact, it's mostly the same thing as the big frames. And while my frames are being done, I rip some wood for all the moldings we'll need later on. But unfortunately, it starts to rain a little bit. So we have to bring everything inside and pick up the sawdust before it gets too damp. We don't have a lot of space inside, but at least we can continue to work. I leave the electric tools outside and I cut the rabbet for the windows. We glue both small frames, and while the glue is drying, we can square up all the round corners of both big frames. Even René came to help. It's not too long before I can check the fit with the actual windows. And this is the ideal moment to cut the small moldings that will hold the fixed windows in place. I cut one side and put it in place right away. This is the last thing we do on our third day. The next day, it's still raining, so we're forced to cut the corners inside again. After putting the window where it belongs and sticking the ceiling foam on it, I'm able to measure the depth of the rabbet I need to cut on the moldings and cut them. While I'm shaping the moldings outside, the other frame is being worked on inside. Now I can cut the moldings of the opening windows. Okay, it's slow going, but not very difficult. It's now time to plane the frames to their final dimensions. Each frame needs to have a tight fit inside the frame that will be screwed to the window opening. Perfect. We just need to make the 10-degree angle to the bottom. This is number 1. The last thing to do on all the frames is to make their surfaces super smooth. Since we remove almost nothing, Ariane doesn't have any trouble doing it. We could even just have used a card scraper, but I didn't bring one. This is starting to look like a window, but we need 2 other frames for the screens. Like the rest, they're made with bridle joints. Since our cuts are not perfect, and I don't want to wait for 24 hours, I glue those frames with 5-minute epoxy glue. Finally, the 5th day turns out to be a super sunny day. A perfect day to brush on the finish. To do so, I make my own mix. 1/3 spar varnish, 1/3 linseed oil, and 1/3 paint thinner. I mix it well, and the three of us brush on the finish. One thing for sure, it doesn't take all day. When the first coat is done, we use almost every horizontal surface I have outside at the cottage. At the end of the day, we brush on the second coat. But the next day, Ariane and Thomas have to leave. I hope they had a good time helping me build my windows. But if not, at least they still have nice memories of things they saw here. But I'm not done yet. I still need to install the windows. The first thing I do is screw the wedge that will close up the gap between the fixed window and the moving one. I begin by screwing one wedge to the moving window, put the frame in place the other wedge where it belongs, and screw the second one. I also need to drill the holes for the strips that will hold the moving window in place. I'm leaving just a small gap between the window and the strip. This is a small taste of what it will look in the end. I'm still not ready to install them yet. I need to staple a screen to the frame and to install the glass panes in the moving frames. So after sticking the weather stripping and putting the glass in place, it's as simple as drilling holes and screwing on the moldings I've made. I also stick weather stripping inside the big frame and I'm ready. We begin by removing the inside frame of the existing window and the window itself. After some modifications on the wall planks, we're ready to put the frame in place. Screw it to the stud. Put the frame of the fixed window and also screw it to the stud. I gently put the glass pane in place and nail its moldings. I'm telling you, this is a stressful moment because last time I installed one, I broke a pane. And I still have a broken window pane in my cottage. But this time around, everything goes smooth. I put the screen in place, the moving window, and the strip that holds it in place. I also need to install some small pulls. With pulls, it's easier to open the window. I don't forget the bolts. I use small pieces of wood that I've cut to length to hold the windows in place. I hit the bolts on the wood to make marks, which I use to guide the drill bit. With those holes, I can keep the window fully open or just a bit. It's quite useful. It's almost over, but I need to take care of this. To do so, I push insulation between the frame and the wall studs. And the last thing to do is to reinstall the original window molding. And the first window is fully installed. Now I need to repeat all this for the second window. Now that both windows are in place, it's time to go outside and caulk them. I don't forget to add a bit of sliding compound. I don't know if that's necessary, but now they slide more easily. And René does the very last thing. This was how I made my 2 new windows at the cottage. I want to thank Ariane and Thomas for their help. And now, after only 6 years, I have a set of 4 identical windows. I hope I didn't bore you too much with an almost repeat of an old episode, but I wanted to share my joy of finally having 2 new cedar windows at the cottage. And I hope to see you soon for another episode of the Woodpecker.